Hi, everybody. My name is Natasha Puri, and I'm a vice president at Lloyds Bank and lead the Diversity and Fund Finance Group. We hope everybody has been staying healthy and well, with the hopes that we'll be seeing you all, in person soon. We're so pleased today to bring to you the next iteration of our Boundary Breakers speaker series, where we're continuing to push our goal of having open conversations. Today we have Marcia Page, who's a founder of Empowered Capital, a firm focused on narrowing the investing gap for women and minority-led and owned funds, and who co-founded Värde Partners, the $14 billion global investment management firm, and Kirsten Voss, Senior Managing Director at Värde, who has also taken on the lead in the past couple of years of Värde's diversity and equity and inclusion efforts, and has been a real driving force for change, including being a founding member of their firm's DEI Executive Council. Our conversation is going to be moderated today by Alex Woodcock, who's a partner in Moron's Cayman Islands Corporate and Finance Practice and avid member of our Diversity and Fund Finance Group. And we're also joined by Annalise Wisdom, another one of our key members of Diversity and Finance Group, who's a partner at Appleby based in their corporate group in Cayman Islands, who's going to wrap up our event later on. So we plan to have about 45 minutes of discussion with these fabulous women, with some time for Q&A, including some that we've had pre-submitted, but please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit any questions during the discussion that we'll try to weave in as we can. I think just in kind of an opening here, I think in planning our discussions for this panel, I've really been inspired and humbled by Marcia and Kirsten, because I think while we're here to learn and share from Värde's successes and the lessons that they've learned, they know too well that there's still so much work that needs to be done. We know that the business need is there for diversity and inclusion, and it hasn't gone away. We need changes at the tone at the top. We need companies to make tangible goals so that ambitions can be realized. And we have to hold ourselves accountable to change, which is why these conversations are so important. So thank you so much, Marcia and Kirsten, for joining us and giving us the time. And I will pass along to Alex and come back in our closing. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. So today we're exploring a journey and noting that Värde has more than doubled the number of diverse investment professionals for the firm in the last 6 years. We wanted to explore Värde's journey, and all of us are on a journey. Myself, I met my now husband in my first year at university. He's of Indian descent, and when we came to graduate and were applying for jobs in law, we both noticed we were getting quite a high proportion of rejections, and we actually felt that perhaps there was something more to it. So we conducted our own little experiment and basically essentially anonymized our resumes. We made them more masculine and took away the Indian sounding surname. And funnily enough, we actually got some responses. We did actually react and inform the relevant organizations that what had happened and that we wouldn't want to pursue any further. I therefore decided to actually circumvent the traditional recruitment process and decided to reach out directly to a female partner at a law firm, and she became my sponsor. She offered me an internship and then eventually a graduate job. So mine was a happy ending, and I found a home in finance. And I actually think, because for me, finance is a global product and global outlook, I actually think the openness of that encouraged people like myself and my husband to get into corporate finance. So that was my personal journey. So I'm interested to hear, Marcia and Kirsten, what are your personal reasons for being involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I'm happy to start, Alex, and thank you for your introductory remarks, and to everybody that's joining today's call. I would just say mine probably started a little bit with a kick in the butt. As the introductory remarks, I founded Värde Partners with two male colleagues. So we started a third in 19 93, right? So here we are at a third, call it diverse. We built the firm to a global alternative investment management firm over more than 2 decades together. And when I moved from that co-CEO, co-CIO role into the chair role at the end of 2015, it coincided with our first kind of true employee engagement survey. And the results were a bit humbling in that our women were less engaged than our men across all of our geographies. And I had a little bit of time for the first time in a long time to kind of step back, look at the industry composition at the time, and realize that not much had changed since I had started in the industry. I mean, the pace of change had been global and very glacial, but also that Värde's numbers were no better, quite honestly, than the industry writ large. At the time, we had 9% women investment professionals, kind of focusing specifically on that investing side of the business and on gender at the time, and that they were turning over at 2 times the rate of men, again, right in line with kind of industry statistics. And I was like, how did we have a female-led firm that started at a third, ended up at less than 10%, and where we believed we had a really, really strong culture, right? Positive culture. And it was just this aha moment where you realize that those were necessary components, but completely insufficient in terms of creating a diverse and inclusive workforce. And this is where our journey, and we're going to be fun to talk about it today a little bit around the research and data-driven ways that you create some intentionality to add to your culture, to add to your leadership, and recognizing how the power of unconscious bias in creating very stubborn brains, such that we really need to bring more than awareness. We need to bring some real intentionality. And that for me was the real beginning of this journey 6 years ago.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to that. Maybe I was the naive one, perhaps, in the bunch when we, this management group was together late in 2015, as Marcia just described. And I sat there and listened to the debate, and I started, of course, stewing. And I thought, for heaven's sakes, we clearly just are not doing a good enough job recruiting. And I had run Värde's business development function for the first 15 years of my time at Värde. So I naively thought that I just needed to sell the firm to candidates as opposed to selling the firm to investors. And, just let me in on this, a little bit of time and we'll just get this fixed. That literally was a little bit of this mindset that I had. And boy, was that woefully misinformed. And, then this journey really began. But mine did come from perhaps a place of naivety, to be frank.
So, we're all aware that it matters for organizations. We hear all the statistics about and the research papers, how it improves decision-making and performance. And we know, for example, that investors are convinced, but I guess with the best will in the world, a lot of people just don't know where to start. So what's really interesting about your journey is you've built and operationalized diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. So Kirsten, how did you go about that?
Yeah, I think the things about the table stakes, before you even can start this work, I think it's important to think about, I think about 4 fundamental table stakes, which is number 1, your organization is bought into the business case. As you say, there's irrefutable research that diverse teams produce better results. So, but your organization they have to be bought into the business case. I think that's table stake number 1. Number 2, your organization, senior leadership, executive team wants change. Real change is not going to happen without a firm-wide desire for different outcomes, because we've got to do some things differently. And so in order to encourage that changing, processes, et cetera, people need to really want change. I think thirdly, this really has to be a business initiative. I believe that this cannot be run, or it can't be owned by HR. It can't be perceived as being owned by HR. But of course, we all work at Värde in this DEI work hand in glove with our HR team. And I think they're, some of the best in the business. So it's highly coordinated, but not run by HR. The business needs to own it. And then, I also think the necessary backdrop for long-term success is this culture piece. And Marcia kind of touched on it in terms of Värde's culture. You've got to have a collegial, open, willing culture to accept, a diverse team. Those are just the table stakes. And then the hard work kind of begins from there. The best analogy that I can use that I think people can kind of grasp onto is the need to run a highly effective and simultaneously run an air war and a ground war. And what do I mean by that? The air war is this setting the tone. It's all about the tone from the top. So your leadership needs to walk the talk and talk the walk. Because if there's any incongruencies in that messaging or behaviors at the top, you're done. And I know that this is certainly the case for Värde, and I'm willing to bet it's the case for every single person on this call today. Our firms are full of incredibly bright people, and they will sniff out an inconsistency in about 45 seconds, right? I mean, it's just, that has to be aligned. And then the ground war is really paying attention to all of your diverse talent wherever they sit in the organization, and just really starting to change some of your HR processes, et cetera, but it's that ground war. We say that, D&I initiatives go to die on the frontline manager, at the frontline manager's seat. We know that people leave their companies. The number one reason they leave their companies is because they don't like their manager. And so it's really an important component to the ground war, the ground war. And so those are my table setting, kinds of pieces that I would share. And then for Värde in early 2016, we really, and this is very consistent with how the firm does a lot of things, but we grabbed a cross geography, cross functional group of leaders together and just started to dig in. And really very early in our work came across a resource. Literally, this book is sitting on my desk. It has for 6 years. Sometimes it gets dusty, but it doesn't, because I pick it up all the time. Iris Bonet, who is a Harvard professor, wrote this book called What Works? Gender Equality by Design. And so much of the fundamental components to this book are debiasing HR processes, because we know you can't debias people. It's just we are all hardwired, and I think actually in this industry, it's even more prevalent because we are having to process so much information that we're always using shortcuts just for our own sanity, right? Well, that is, then you really get yourself, stuck into some of these, kind of biased ways to make quick assumptions. And that is so much of what has to be rethought, rejiggered in terms of helping, people to get out of their heads a little bit and be more intentional. So that's kind of that's the table setting exercise.
I would just,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add a couple of real quick things to the air war piece, which we and Kirsten was, really leads the effort is on, establishing the DEI council. In the case of Värde, George Hicks, the CEO, one of the co-CEOs, and now Ilfin Carstairs are really chairing that project. So that's kind of been, a very visible way that their air war kind of happens at Värde. And the other thing that we've done, early on was start setting targets. We've got more work to do on that geographically, but we started with gender in the investing side to get to 30% of our investment professionals by 2025 and have basically an expectation at each of the parts of the organization that they'll be contributing to that effort, that it wasn't going to get siloed in certain parts of the organization. And I would just add those two kind of practical bits to the air war analogy.
So would you say, because there's some debate around setting targets and KPIs, do you see that as necessary to put in place along with the systems for it to work?
Yeah, I do actually. I think that sometimes they get conflated with quotas. But to me, in this industry, this is how we run a business. If it's a business initiative, we set KPIs, we set milestones, we set targets, and we set deadlines. And to me, this is a business initiative, and we're treating it in effect exactly the way that any other significant and intentional business initiative would be. So I'm a fan of it. We've had discussions about this over time, but I think Värde has gotten quite comfortable with approaching it in that manner.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Iris's book, and she's also got some really good snippets on the internet with some of her presentations. Did you look at any other resources by way of research to lay the foundations for your execution of plan?
Absolutely. A lot of white papers. I think even some additional books. And I'm not remembering them right off the top of my head right now, but a couple of the works that I think about, Deloitte did an incredibly good piece on inclusion, which I found to be kind of transformational in our thinking. And it really laid the groundwork for us actually putting everybody in our firm through a conscious inclusion training session. So that piece was very, very interesting. BCG, McKinsey. I mean, there's just a ton of content. One of the other, and Harvard, Harvard has done a bunch of reports as well. But I will tell you that Iris's book really was a fundamental backbone to many of the things that we adopted early on as best practices. Do we do them perfectly? No, no, but we strive to utilize so many of her tactics in the recruiting phase, or and even in our promotion process, we've made some changes. They're seemingly small, but can actually have an outsized impact. And so we also brought Iris Bonet into our annual planning meeting the year after this effort kind of kicked off. And to see the expressions on our team's faces as she spoke about, so Alex, that experiment that you and your fiance ran, I mean, there's full on research, doing the same thing. And I will tell you that our senior leaders, as they listened to these stories, sat there and said, how can we do better? I mean, it was really a helpful awakening, if you will, that I think primed the organization for the proposed changes.
I think part of why, I was just going to say, I think part of why the book and maybe the timing of it, and mine is earmarked, all over and highlighted as well, is that, we talked about the business case being irrefutable, but being able to bring research and data driven detail to these, as an underpinning to the notion of hardwiring the organization to mitigate unconscious bias is, of course, when you're talking about a very, I guess, data-driven type of employee base. We also knew, and I think we were strategic around this at the time, that would be well received as well, right? So that it was something that had some kind of tangible and hard research and data-driven underpinnings to it. And I think if we go back a few years ago and we're completely honest, Kirsten, it was a way to bring it forward in the organization more quickly and accelerate some of our thinking.
For sure, yeah. Marcia and I have done a number of stealthy things to move the needle, and that might have been one of them. We just slipped that into the agenda. Yeah.
And then, you mentioned also a phrase, de-biasing the HR process. What do you mean by that, Kirsten?
Yeah, and this is some of my favorite observations, I think, and learnings over the last couple of years. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about what we've done on the recruiting side, and then Marcia maybe can speak a little bit to the retention promotion process, because we looked at that whole life cycle of talent. But really from a recruiting perspective, it was incredibly eye-opening from, changing and reviewing, for example, job descriptions and de-biasing job descriptions. We know that, let's say we have 10 items, qualifications for a specific job. And when men look at those job descriptions and see that they have, 4 of the qualifications laid out, they go ahead and apply for the job. They can see that they're qualified. By contrast, what women do is they look at them and say, my gosh, I've only got 8. I probably can't apply for this job. I'm not going to get it. And so we started to look at, well, wait a second, what is some of the language that we have in this that might cause somebody to think they're not qualified for the role? And I guess one thing, just as a little public service announcement to our audience members, if you have 4 of the 10, qualifications, apply for the job, okay? Because your competition is, you should just, that's one really tangible takeaway from today. So that was one component. We also know that you need to review resumes all at the same time for a position. Because what happens if you do this kind of willy-nilly one-off, you start to compare the resume that you're looking at to this fictional idea of what your ideal candidate looks like. And you can then kind of pass over resumes pretty easily. What we find is, if the research tells us that if you review all those resumes side by side, so you're actually comparing real candidate to real candidate, in fact, the bias, both from a gender and experience level or experiences, is eliminated. What happens is hiring managers pick the best candidates from the actual real applicable candidate pool. The other 2 other really important components to the recruiting process are to require a diverse slate of candidates. I now see that in almost all the best practices. So that note is getting, that has gotten out there, but we've said, hey, we're not going to start interviewing candidates until, for a position, until we see a diverse slate of candidates presented. And then the last one, which was, hit me hard because I was a complete and total violator of this best practice, was to use structured interviews. I think this also in big companies perhaps is, known as a best practice too, but we weren't doing this. And I can just call on my own experience. I would, at every interview, first thing I would do is try to warm up the candidate, find some area of commonality, and then go through my interview questions. And what you're doing there is just reinforcing this, similarity bias or likeness bias. A structured interview process is asking the same questions in the same order of each candidate, kind of ranking them, and then, saving that small talk until at the very end of the interview. And that, quite frankly, was a complete turn upside down in terms of just how I was personally conducting interviews. And we've, kind of put the firm through interview training to really highlight this as one of the fundamental pieces to how you can debias this. And let's face it, right? Recruiting and hiring is chock full of all these little tripwires that can happen because you're just so naturally drawn to people that are similar to you. And so we really spent a lot of time talking about why we need to make these changes. And I think it's helped our process a fair bit.
Yeah, so I'm happy to pick up a little bit. I think one of the takeaways from Kirsten's comments is, and just a reminder, unfortunately, there is no silver bullet, right? But we know that some of these individual, we call it hardwiring to mitigate unconscious bias, does move the needle cumulatively. And that some of them are relatively easy to bring in and are very scalable and can be adopted at any size firm. And so if we turn to a little bit the promotion process that we brought to Värde and some of the insights, I think in the other kind of kick in the rear, it's the research that's been done around the promotion and the fact that women are promoted even in the first leveling in this industry at a slower pace than men. So I personally took on thinking through how we bring some of these best practices to the promotion process and kind of adapt it for what would work within Värde. But let me give you one very small example that could be, applied across any industry, any size firm. And that was one of the insights from the book, What Works, which is take away the self-ratings before you go into a promotion process. Why? And this goes a little bit to Kirsten's earlier point. Women self-rate lower than men. So even the most well-intentioned manager is probably seeing a lower rating, self-rating from a woman than a man going into the promotion process to begin with. So a very simple thing is just stop the self-rating, right? As part of a promotion or review system. So we've pulled those generally out. The other thing that we've done is a two-step process in the promotion process. It hasn't slowed down the annual process, but it definitely has required more resources to bring it to life. It's a two-step process. So classically, you get to the end of the year and you've got a manager making a recommendation for promotion. What we've added to each manager is a requirement that they also then, for each person that reports to them, indicate why they're not promoting the other people that report to them against the same criteria. So the first thing is it creates kind of an intentionality for that frontline manager and accountability in terms of how and who they're promoting at that point in time. And then the second piece that we brought to bear is in effect a separate committee that basically we call the calibration committee. So this is a committee that has, inquiry rights, and their job is really to calibrate. I call it the hard graders with the easy graders, the easier promoters or the tougher promoters, and make sure that that's getting calibrated across that entire level in the organization. And then this calibration committee makes a recommendation to the ultimate decision-making body. In the case of the most senior promotions within Värde now, those go to a blind vote at the partner group. So we also look to basically, mitigate the loudest or most senior voice in the room who may or may not have a line of sight to that actual individual person that's being promoted. And then going to the accountability piece, and this is where Kirsten's work on the DEI Council is really going back and confirming and monitoring those promotion rates over time. So it sounds like a lot of additional effort, but it's two kind of data and research driven ways that we've adopted, this mitigating of unconscious bias in our promotion process. And we've basically continued to iterate on this over the course of the last 3 years. Personally, it's something I'm quite proud of and has been adopted across really all parts of the organization as part of our promotion. Ultimately, we want people coming into the organization and that are here, and we want to retain them because they know they have a fair shot.
And I might just, if I could, just call out one more PSA from Marcia's comments there. On this self-rating piece for the participants that are on the call today, if your organization does that, which I think a lot of them do, don't understand that your competition, again, I like the way Marcia frames these things, is let's understand what the competition is doing, and so that we can, level the playing field here. They've got a high view of their contributions, and you probably should too. So, try to mitigate that, that idea that, women consistently, and we see this in the research, just rate themselves lower. I think it's this modest, bit, that might be part of our DNA. And you need to kind of shake that loose a little bit, perhaps.
I mean, you mentioned how you had Iris Bonet speak with Värde, and the look of astonishment on some people's faces. Did you face any obstacles? Did leaders push back, or were they, the penny dropped and they absorbed the proposed changes?
Oh boy, I wish that was as easy as that, Alex. That sounds fantastic. No, right? We call this a journey for a reason. And I like to say that one of the things I think we've done well is to understand all these different component parts, really suss out what we think and how we think it should apply to our organization, our leadership team, our culture, because these have to be customized to your organization. And which is a reason I think when you have the business leading it and you have a senior person that understands the culture of your organization is a really important component to perhaps some of that table stakes setting. So no, not everything has been, it hasn't been, an easy ride. But what's happened over the course of the last 6 years, I feel like we've just incrementally keep building. And all of a sudden, there feels like we've hit kind of this tipping point where, people are, oh, okay, I get it. I understand what we're doing, and, want to be involved and want to, do better. We've got our hiring managers now saying, why don't I have a more diverse slate of candidates? Wow, yay, that's exactly what, we're trying to get accomplished. And I would, early on, I think we were still thinking, hey, we got to do this stuff fast, or you got to hire, maybe a little bit quicker, because this does take a little bit longer, just from when you think about the recruiting process, no doubt. And so that's just something I think that's evolved as people have better understood the firm's objectives here. I don't know, Marcia, if you would, how else you see that, but
no, I think that's fair. If you think about any change initiative in an organization, right, it doesn't happen overnight, right? And it requires, Kirsten's probably being a bit humble here, to stepped into this role in leading our DEI efforts, had enormous credibility and seniority in the organization, right? So that got us off to a very good start. But change in this instance and moving the needle kind of from a number standpoint just takes a lot of time. So you have to have some stick-to-itiveness as well. But I love the idea if you organizations are adaptable, right? And, creating that right tone, getting some early wins, all of the same things you do in any other change management initiative I think have some application here. And then sometime we're going to look up and it's going to have been embedded, and you're going to have forgotten that, X years ago, this is the way we did it. I can think about this in other business initiatives where it's that ultimate embedding, and we're not necessarily talking about it anymore. But this one has a longer timeline on it than many other business initiatives, and I think is what makes it a bit unique in getting it to that embedded status.
One of our attendees had quite a specific question, and it relates to parental leave. Basically, how did you work into the revised systems and practices enabling people to return to work after parental leave?
Should I take that one, Marcia?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You've been on the front lines on that one.
Yeah. So we, we run we have a global firm. So we've got people in the US, Europe, and Asia. And one of the things that we did, and now all these I don't know, COVID's done something with my ability to exactly remember the timelines on things, but maybe it was in 2020, we really looked hard at our parental leave policies and extended them, certainly in the US. Okay, so, there were mandated things, in Europe and Asia. But we very, very intentionally did a couple of things. One, extend, and this language is really important too, inclusive language around a primary caregiver and a secondary caregiver, so that we've got a structure that is acknowledging all family types. But our primary caregiver leave, went from 12 weeks to 18 weeks in the US. And our secondary caregiver leave went from 2 weeks to 4 weeks. And one of the things I'm actually quite proud of is how our male managers are encouraging our male colleagues to take their parental leave, because we know that if you can get that to be part of the system, the stigma of the longer leave for the primary caregiver can be somewhat alleviated. We have also looked at just benefits for when parents come back, even some, so the life work balance coaching, how do you come back, enter the workplace, some benefits, for example, around, shipping, breast milk back home if you've had to, travel early on when you've come back to the office. And so I think one of the interesting things about this, this topic is when we had some investors in investor due diligence meetings asking our portfolio managers about parental leave, they're like, what are you? I mean, I should only be talking about, corporate traded debt, blah, 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 blah. That got people to notice. And in fact, one of the people that was really quite inquisitive around this topic is somebody that Marcia has hired now to run part of the due diligence on Empowered. We love Chrissy Pariso's stick-to-itiveness and her level of inquiry, and she stood out as an investor who was really focused on some of these really important issues. But I'll tell you, that really got our PM's attention. This is just stuff that they weren't thinking about. And so many of these things, show up in the operational due diligence questionnaire from investors, right? And oftentimes that just you fill it out and nobody is thinking about it. I think investors have really brought many DEI initiatives to the fore, quite frankly.
Yeah, and that's been my experience as well. Clients want you to mirror their social missions. I mean, only last week we were asked to pitch for a transaction, and we actually had to confirm that we would have a diverse team on the deal and provide bios. So yeah, I think it's universal now that that clients of all organizations are are focused on this point in particular, down to the individual transaction level as well. And your point about parental leave chimes with me. I mean, 10 years ago, my husband took 4 hours off for our second child. And now, you know, I'm happy to see colleagues, you know, happily take 2 full weeks off, if you know, in the case of the secondary caregiver. So yeah, there's definitely been a cultural change. Do you see any other sort of influences from external relationships? Do you see other sponsors? Do you confer with other sponsors to see, to sort of share ideas and initiatives?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Marcia, you're on mute.
Oh,
There.
you want to
but
start
are
on
you
that? And yeah. Oh, well, I'll take the first. One thing that I'm on several investment committees, so I've also got kind of this point of view of, you know, the LP as well, from very different types of organizations, from family offices to endowments and foundations, community foundations, universities. And it is a regular topic of conversation for sure, right? Some organizations are much further along and call it embedding it in their ESG policies, or keeping DEI and ESG almost as separate initiatives, and, you know, creating kind of expectations from a portfolio perspective within their portfolios. And I will also say that we're seeing a lot of initiatives from the consultants in the industry as well, right, that are advising these various committees and seeking to bring more diverse slates, for lack of a better description, of, you know, potential GPs to offer. I would still characterize it as early innings in my view. Even those that are further along in their thinking are, you know, sorting out how to basically kind of operationalize it, right? So there's policies in place, and there's expectations, and there's some targets being built, but getting to action and allocations, I would say, is very much early innings.
Yeah, and another attendee's had a question about, obviously, over the last year, there have been heightened calls for racial equality and awareness in light of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US in particular. Did Värde have a response to that, or the systems were in place to prove that DEI was a real focus?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And we actually, one of our clients, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, invited Värde to participate along with GPs. And this was actually in 2019, late 2019, early 2020, in a program called Expanding Equity, which was really, they did in partnership with a big consulting firm. This is digging in again to the research and the data around just the lack of equity, particularly in the investment management business. Sorry, my computer here is giving me a bunch of reminders. Apologize for that. And we were able to participate in a year-long, I guess, construct, training, et cetera, around the issues of, you know, inclusion, belonging, recruiting, you know, promoting, retaining a more racially diverse group of candidates and employees. It was incredibly transformational, I think, for our efforts in this area. We started, and we've spent a lot of time talking about gender here today. And that's just where we started. But this participation in the W.K. Kellogg Foundation's Expanding Equity program really helped, I think, jettison us along this path. We took some immediate action out of that, those sessions and trainings, including, you know, creating for the first time a very structured entry level, junior talent entry level position, with a high desire to have most of the participants in what this is called the Värde rotational program, to come from diverse backgrounds. We've partnered with management leaders for tomorrow, an organization in the US that coaches from undergraduates, so sophomores in college, to that first placement in a job, and most of that talent is Black talent, Latinx talent. We have partnered with them so that we can kind of raise Värde's profile on that with those candidates, because quite frankly, right, we're a 300-person organization, so we have to partner and try to, we're not going to be able to raise Värde's profile all by ourselves in these different candidate pools. And so we're really thinking about ways that we can leverage some of these organizations that are already in existence to raise our profile. And so it has been a really important part of our work, I would say, for the last 2.5 years, working on implementing everything that we've learned from that expanding equity program. It's something I'm personally I'm so grateful that we had that opportunity. I'm proud of the organization for stepping up and recognizing what an incredible invitation that was for us to be in the W.K. Kellogg Foundation's initial cohort. And I think it's been really important and informative to our efforts.
One thing that I think was interesting about the expanding equity program is they adopted a bit of the air war and had a requirement that the people attending that were very, senior leaders in the organization. So that was an expectation of being part of that first cohort.
And that was so powerful. Of course they did it well. They are so smart on this topic. It was really quite a privilege to just, once you started to reflect back, to see all these component parts that they put in place in order to, increase chances of success.
So that leads me to my question to Marcia about setting the tone as a leader. What recommendations do you have to other leaders in organizations?
Oh, right. I go back to where I started maybe this part of the conversation, and just recognizing the intentionality that needs to be, a starting point, and recognizing that it's going to be slightly different for each individual organization. And I think Kirsten touched on that. How do you take this and adapt it for your organization so that you have the highest likelihood of success? How do you create something, and this goes to my earlier comment as well, that allows you to sustain it, to be able to stick with it for the period of time so that you can get those results and embed it in the system. I've often used an analogy that, back pre-pandemic, of being in a big gym, right, with all these people on treadmills, and, had some people having it up on on 10, but can't sustain it. Others are slowly going at it, but barely starting. And, everybody's on their own kind of pace and journey. Be able to pace it so you can sustain it, but get started, get a few early wins in there. I think one of the things that ironically has played well externally is that we've been a bit humble about where we started, and recognized that we had work to do, and that we were working toward that. What I'm seeing in the inquiries from potential investors, for example, is not that you've got it all figured out on day one, but that you're making effort year over year, and you can see progress on an annual basis. And so some of the surveys that are happening both at the consultants and at the LP level are really about progress. and moving from a starting point that we all know is woefully short. So I guess that would be my other comment is get started. Do something that works for your organization and make sure that you're creating some accountability year over year. And I think that that is how we're going to get there and actually get to something that, my hope is someday we're not having these conversations, but it might not be in my lifetime. I hope it's well inside of it. I think, did Alex, I think she might have frozen Kirsten, is that right?
It looks like it, yes. This is gonna be our, oh, there, Natasha.
I'll just show up then. I think, honestly, I'm always, I enjoy these conversations so much, and I think you've illustrated so much that it's still a journey, that it continues. But maybe Kirsten, your thoughts too on just kind of what else to do, how, especially I think for this audience, it's always key of, you are so good at illustrating for tone at the top and really needing that buy-in from the senior leaders. But how do you give advice to people who are maybe more junior? How do you stay, engaged and want to keep doing the work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are, some days you wake up and think, oh my gosh, really, the starting point here is that by the time girls are in third grade, they think they're not good at math. And I'm like, sometimes I just want to stay in bed, put the covers over my head and just go, I can't do it. But then you guys, I think, as Marcia just said, this getting started and the intentionality piece, oftentimes I'll have people say, well, what do you think was the most important thing that you did at Värde? And I literally say, just starting, just getting going, because it's then that intentionality that runs through everything, and you just kind of start chipping away at it. I think for, the audience members, one of the things that I really, would like to encourage women to do is understand where, if you're looking for a new opportunity or you're searching for, potentially a new role, I don't think it should take you that long to understand if a firm is serious about this. I mean, you can look at what's happening on their LinkedIn page, look what's happening on their websites. Organizations that are really making an effort at this are talking about it, because we're trying a lot of things. We've put a lot of resources in this, and it won't take you long to figure out that Värde is serious about this. If it's a mystery to you what the firm is doing, it's not a mystery. It means they're really not doing anything. I mean, that is kind of how I would describe that. And I think that we all now, owe it to ourselves to work for organizations that are taking these things seriously. I kind of, I think about an early career experience that I had where I was N of one in an organization of, 65, folks. And I didn't get it now having all these words and this experience, I understand that my experience as an only that's what made me miserable. And I left without having another job, lined up. I won't make that mistake again. I think is kind of is just a little bit of advice that I'd give to your participants on the call today.
Yeah, each of us has agency, right? I think, going to your point, Kirsten, and choices, right? And I think this is a remarkable time in history to be able to, use that agency, make choices that can work for you individually and that reflect on your purpose and where that organization might be. And then, that those micro supports too that we provide to each other, those daily actions they actually matter. They change norms. They lift up the voices of those that are underrepresented, and those small daily acts of support make a difference as well. So we've got long run and short run ways that we can kind of make a difference.
I hear you. I think I echo that too. And in my own experience, I started out in a accounting role, but it was for like an effort for minorities in getting in the door. And that's kind of driven my passion here, where you're saying, okay, every little bit counts. Anyone who joins the conversation, who's listening, this makes a difference. And even if you get to one person, or you hope it's a lot more, and opening their ears, that again, it's the starting point. Let's move forward together. There's a lot of work to do. I think we all fully understand that. But yeah, I know I'm conscious of time, but any other maybe closing thoughts from you guys that you'd like to share?
I would just, this conversation really is exactly what you're discussing, right? It's sharing our own experience, being open to that with other organizations, other individuals, and encouraging others to get started, right? So actually, I'd like to thank you for your leadership and for creating and sponsoring this conversation. It's a privilege to be part of it.
That's a good note for to end on, I think.
Thank you. Annalise, if you want to reappear too, who's been key in helping too, I'll pass over to Annalise for any of her closing thoughts as we wrap this conversation up. But again, thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Natasha. This has been such an engaging and practical conversation this morning. Just thank you, Marcia and Kirsten, for your intentional and sustained efforts towards these tangible changes in the diversity and inclusion arena. And thank you for responding to that initial awakening all those years ago. And also for putting yourselves out there in such a transparent fashion. Your commitment to holding yourself, I think, almost radically accountable is admirable. And we just wish you every continued success. Thank you so much. Well, technology, I guess, defeated Alex, but we thank her so much for moderating this event, this second in our Boundary Breakers speakers series so smoothly. Oh, here she is. She's back. She's back with us.
Just in time.
I'm so sorry, technology. Don't you love it?
I mean, makes it memorable and classic in the Zoom world. So,
Alex, we were just thanking you for moderating so smoothly and for managing the
Until
content so well. Yeah, it happens. And to everyone who has attended, we do encourage you to sign up for updates from the Diversity in Fund Finance team to keep track of current events and to get access to our newsletter. Our next issue will feature resources and articles that Kirsten has kindly shared with us in preparing this series. So thank you all again. Marcia and Kirsten have already thanked Natasha for her leadership and her vision, and I just fully echo that. Thanks to all for attending. See you at our next event.
hopefully in person. But yes, thank you guys. Have a great day.
Bye.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.